Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Now you are all awake. Okay, so we've lost just about 10 minutes, but I'm sure we will recover it. We have a terrific panel of two people and a terrific subject to deal with. That if you remember Leonardo and Jose Campos' rather exciting exchange. It's there's around various elements of multipolarity in terms of institutions, and maybe it points to a more interesting discussion this morning, perhaps a much broader. So let me just introduce the speakers, both of them at the same time. So Walden Bello. Many of you or many of us have know Walden Bello for a very long time. Walden is a former member of the House of Representatives of the Philippines and also a former member of the Communist Party of the Philippines. He received the Right Livelihood Awards, also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize, in 2003 and was named the Outstanding Public Scholar by the International Studies Association in 2008. He was named the most distinguished defender of human rights by Amnesty International in the Philippines in 2023. He is currently on trial on charges of cyber libel brought against him by his friend, Vice President Sarah Dushante, but was given permission to travel because he told the judge he would not afford to disappoint Chandru and Jayati. Walden Bello has 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with all of you, with old friends as well as new friends, and many that whose names I've come across in different publications. The topic that I have today is geopolitics. Is it shrinking or expanding policy space? Today, August 9, is the 79th anniversary of the nuclear bombing of Nagasaki, one of the key events that ushered in the post-World War II international order, marked by the hegemony of the United States. A key part of that order was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Also a central part of that order was the Bretton Woods system. The ideological pillar of that order was liberal democracy, American style, a view that Joe Biden expressed at the recent NATO summit in July when he repeated Madeleine Albright's awful paean to America as, quote, the indispensable nation, unquote. The whole regime is now under heavy strain, buffeted both from outside the West and within the West. When assessing issues related to the Bretton Woods institutions, access to capital, the emergency and development financing, the new debt crisis and policy space for developing countries, it is imperative that we see them in this broader geopolitical context, or we might miss some of the key features of the new situation. I think that many of us are familiar with the new debt crisis, and so I won't touch on the details. But what has been the response of the Bretton Woods institutions to this new global debt crisis? It is that these countries have lived beyond their means, and consequently, as Indermit Gill, chief economist of the World Bank and a Chicago boy, told the New York Times rather cynically, these countries have, quote, essentially two ways to pay their bills: printing more money or raising taxes. One leads to inflation, the other leads to unrest. Blaming the victims as living beyond their means is the time-honored way the Bretton Woods institutions have explained the debt crisis of developing countries. There is today, however, another excuse that the IMF and the World Bank resort to hide their total incapacity to deal with the debt crisis. And that is to engage in the geopolitical blame game, that is, to paint China as the culprit. Typical of this is former Deputy IMF Deputy Director Ann Kruger's assertion that, quote, China's emergence as a leading creditor has created problems, not least because it has refused an invitation to join the Paris Club, while Paris Club members share information about the sums owed to them, China does not, nor has it been willing to participate meaningfully in multilateral debt restructuring arrangements. Instead, it has operated as a black box, attaching non-disclosure agreements to many of its loans and funneling credit through a wide range of agencies. Beijing's Ministry of Foreign Affairs hotly disputed this effort to blame China for the new developing country debt crisis, saying, and I quote, multilateral financial institutions and commercial creditors hold nearly 3/4 of Africa's total external debt. They take a larger share of Africa's debt, and they can and should take more robust actions to relieve the debt burden of African countries. What appears to be operating in this exchange between Western and Chinese officials is a fundamental difference. The Western view that debt relief should be conditioned on the acceptance of austerity programs with IMF-type conditionalities, and China's more balanced, more strategic approach that takes into consideration the developing countries' need for capital, for infrastructure, and production to enable them to grow and thus better service their debts in the long term. As China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs notes, Africa's debt problem is essentially an issue of development. The solution to the problem requires addressing not only the symptoms, but also the root causes by means of debt treatment, among the others, so as to enhance Africa's independent and sustainable development capacity. In retrospect, the period from 2000 to 2018 was the golden age of China's development lending, one that coincided with China's ascent to becoming the center of global capital accumulation, accounting at the end of that period for 28% of all growth worldwide, which was more than twice the share of the United States. China, as Kevin Gallagher notes rightly, is now, quote, the world's largest development bank. Two of its agencies, the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China, have provided nearly $1 trillion worth of financing to foreign countries since the early 2000s. The record also shows that China wrote off $72 million owed by Cameroon in 2019, $72 million owed by Botswana, and $10.6 million owed by Lesotho in 2018, and $160 million owed by Sudan in 2017. The Rhodium Research Group found 40 instances of renegotiations of debts to China amounting to $50 billion across 24 countries since 2000. While some Chinese finance development projects have been criticized, rightly, for a number of different reasons, for instance, that their gains go mainly to developing country elites, or that, as Arundhati Roy puts it, they have a penchant for, quote, gigantism, unquote, or massive infrastructure projects. Overall, in my view, China's aid has been, on balance, hugely positive for the global South. It has offered an alternative source of financing to Western multilateral and bilateral and commercial lending, thus providing developing countries with development space or policy space that is foreclosed by the usual IMF conditionalities. One of the questions that is now being posed is how access to financial and development assistance will be affected by the geopolitical conflict with China that the United States is provoking. The implicit threat contained in the statements of Ann Kruger that I referred to earlier is that the Bretton Woods institutions will not look kindly on those countries whose debt portfolio contains a large proportion of Chinese financing. In fact, it is not only the access to the IMF and World Bank resources that is now at stake in developing countries' relations with China, but also IMF and World Bank voting reform. As Pablo Noguera Batista Brazil's former executive director at the IMF has underlined, and I quote, the rivalry between the West, led by the US, and emerging powers, notably China, is at the root of the current widespread pessimism concerning IMF reform. Always a difficult endeavor, this reform now stumbles on the fact that the main shareholders, the US, European countries, and Japan, as well as other high-income nations, are dead set against contemplating any reform that would provide more decision-making power to China. In short, the long-desired increase in the voting power of both the so-called emerging economies and the least developed countries is likely to end up as a collateral victim of the West's new Cold War on China. However, one must not ignore positive developments. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iran, Ethiopia, and Egypt have officially joined the BRICS, with nearly 50 other countries indicating their intention to join. Saudi Arabia and Qatar, with the tremendous financial resources locked up in their sovereign wealth funds, are the most significant new members from the point of view of development and emergency financing. Saudi Arabia has a sovereign wealth fund of $925 billion and Qatar 475 to 500 billion. These sums could potentially bolster the firepower of the contingent reserve arrangement and the new development bank, which had loaned some $32 billion by the end of 2022. As pointed out yesterday, it's not only BRICS collective capital that have the potential to be alternative sources of capital. There are the regional financial arrangements, such as the Chiang Mai Initiative, Contingent Reserve Fund, Latin American Reserve Fund, and the Arab Monetary Fund, which have a total of $329 billion available for the emerging and developing economies. So far, I have focused on the challenge to the liberal international order posed by the crisis and demands of the global South. However, there are internal challenges to the reign of neoliberalism and liberal democracy coming from within the West itself that will have massive implications for the Cold War order. Donald Trump, as we observed from his first term in office, tore up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, considered NATO a burden, trampled on the rules of the World Trade Organization, ignored the IMF and the World Bank, negotiated the US withdrawal from Afghanistan with the Taliban, and broke the West's united front against Korea by crossing into that country to negotiate with Kim Jong-un. Some have said that his foreign policy was erratic, but there was an underlying logic to his supposed madness. And this was his felt need to play opportunistically to a strong feeling among people in the US that they are tired of bearing the burdens of empire, that America is not an indispensable nation, as Albright and Biden put it, that defending the empire has been a major cause of the United States' economic decline, that big tech and Wall Street are a major part of the problem, and that American corporations have betrayed the American people by shipping investment and jobs overseas. One finds the same suspicion and resentment of transnational institutions in the European far right that is on the move from France to Hungary. Indeed, my friend Viktor Orban of Hungary has been very critical of NATO and condemned the European Union, another pillar of the West, for destroying the nation state, and has described it in a recent important speech as a malign political entity, quote, under the occupation of a liberal oligarchy. This left liberal elite is in fact organizing a transatlantic elite, not European, but global, not based on the nation state, but federal, and not democratic, but oligarchic. Pounded by the increasingly powerful far right, Brussels is on the defensive, and it knows that if France's Marine Le Pen and the Alternative for Deutschland comes to power and joins Italy's Giorgia Meloni, the European Union's 70-year-old project of liberal, political, and neoliberal economic integration will become a thing of the past. In that very same speech, Orban captures succinctly what Trump's anti-globalist agenda really is, and I quote, "Many people think that if Donald Trump returns to the White House, the Americans will want to retain their world supremacy by maintaining their position in the world. I think that this is wrong. Of course, no one gives up positions of their own account, but that will not be the most important goal. On the contrary, the priority will be to rebuild and strengthen North America. This means not only the US, but also Canada and Mexico, because together they form an economic area. And America's place on the world will be less important. You have to take what the president says seriously. America first, everything here, everything will come home. I do not know if you have read what the president has said. They will trigger massive US infrastructure development, military research, and innovation. They will achieve, or perhaps they have already achieved, energy self-sufficiency and raw material self-sufficiency. And finally, they will improve ideologically, giving up on the export of democracy. America first, the export of democracy is at an end. That is the essence of the experiment America is conducting in response to the situation described there. Now, of course, both Orban and Trump espouse racial and nativist values that most of us would find repulsive. But our point here is that we must see that Trump is not interested in expanding a liberal empire via free trade and the free flow of capital, an order defended by a political canopy of multilateralism and promoted by an economic ideology of globalization and a political ideology of liberal democracy. What he is interested in is in building a fortress America that is much, much less engaged with the world, where the multilateral institutions through which the US has exercised its economic power, NATO, and the Bretton Woods institutions would be much less relevant as instruments of US power. Deal-making, like the one Trump conducted with Kim Jong-un, would instead be one of the main methods of defending American interests. It is not only Orban who has claimed that the far right is inward instead of outward looking. One of the things that Sir Richard Evans, one of the leading authorities on fascism, got right in our Cambridge Union debate in 2021 was that while traditional fascism was expansionist, today's far right is all about wanting to wall off the outside world. Others have gone further and said that whatever may be the new Cold War liberal rhetoric about America being the indispensable country, Western disengagement with most of the rest of the world is irreversible. Instead, in its latest issue, The Economist appears to be saying that it is all over but the shouting. And let me quote, "As the West has turned inward, China and the rest of the emerging world have drawn closer. The consequences of its decision to turn inward and shield itself from Chinese competition will take years to become completely clear. But the world is not standing still. Western multinationals have long been the main agents of cross-border trade and investment, and some of the biggest beneficiaries of openness. Today, they are surrendering ground in the world's largest growing and most populous markets. China is already reaping the rewards." If the far-rightist Orban and the neoliberal economists are correct, that whatever the results of the November 2024 US elections, the trend is, in the medium and long term, towards a fortress America and a fortress Europa, the questions we must pose to ourselves are the following. One, instead of knocking our heads against the wall, pushing for reform of the IMF, World Bank, and the WTO, shouldn't our governments just play a defensive holding operation to prevent them from becoming even worse than they are now? Two, should we not be putting our governments to adopt a comprehensive strategy to speed up Western disengagement? Three, what steps must the BRICS take to step into the vacuum left by a West that is less engaged with the rest of the world so that we will avoid the social costs that accompanied the collapse of the socialist states of Eastern Europe in the 1990s? Four, how do we ensure that the period of transition is one that leads to more financing, policy space, and a new deal for the Global South, and not one mainly for the more powerful BRICS? By way of conclusion, I would like to make a comment on the upcoming US elections. Kamala Harris represents the old anachronistic Cold War liberal international order that seeks to contain China militarily, pledges full military support for Israel, disdains negotiations for peace in Ukraine, and indeed would drag our governments to the conflict there, and seeks continuation of the multilateral economic order that has kept the global south down for the last 70 years. Trump and Vance offer a Fortress America agenda whose thrust is to disengage from what Trump has called shithole countries, one that is focused on keeping the rest of the world out of the United States and using periodic unilateral military strikes like those employed by the Israelis to discipline those outside the wall, meaning us, and leaving our surroundings a wasteland. Confronted with these alternatives, do we in the global south really have to take sides? In conclusion, the coincidence of the Bretton Woods system to deal with the developing country debt crisis, China's becoming a powerful actor, and the rise to dominance of the far right in Europe and the United States, may be the alignment of stars necessary for the birth of a new global order. There is that enigmatic line the Italian Marxist Gramsci used to describe the era that is maybe also appropriate for ours. Quote, "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." To the two monsters that are the genocidal war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine, there may even be added a war in the South China Sea, my neighborhood, where the US is trying its best to provoke China to a confrontation, with General Mike Minihan, who leads the US Air Mobility Command, declaring, and I quote, "My gut tells me," his stomach tells him, "that we will fight in 2025. We live in very dangerous times, but it seems like great opportunities for real change and great danger have always been twins." I thank you.
Thank you very much, Walden. Our second speaker wants to be introduced only as a former UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development. But of course, we know he's a lot more. Jomo Sundaram. 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you, Chandru, and others in the IDEAS team, and also the team from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro for all your efforts to organize this event. And I want to express my personal appreciation for the hospitality we have enjoyed here. And also, once again, to record our great appreciation for the contribution of Maria Conceição Tavares, who was a great inspiration for us before. I must say, remind us that when we first came here in 2022, sorry, not 2020, in 2002, we came here before Lula was elected president, and so there was a lot of time and tremendous engagement. When we came back in 2003, there was much less engagement because many of our interlocutors were in power. Subsequently, when we kept track of our colleagues, many of them subsequently broke with the regime. But I think we need to recognize the need for unity in very difficult times. We are a besieged minority, and I think it's important for us to learn to conduct struggles and handle differences in a constructive fashion. In following the organizers' request, and also following Walden, who I'm not sure he was introduced as a vice presidential candidate, but you know what vice presidents can become. There are several people in the audience here who associates at some point in the distant past of Kamala Harris's father, who is still alive and living in Washington. and was a very important inspiration for many people, particularly with his work on capital accumulation and income distribution. But allow me now to move to what I allow me now to move to the thrust of my argument. Much of what I'm going to argue is, in a sense, a self-criticism of what some of the positions I've taken in the past. But I think the challenges of the times in which we live are so novel that we run the risk of becoming irrelevant if we do not recognize the implications of the new situation we are in. Firstly, I think it's important to recognize that there is no serious interest in the US in terms of ensuring a buoyant, growing economy in the world. There are many reasons. I don't have the time to spell it all out, but I think it's important for us to recognize that the US is also very exceptional in the world in having a central bank which is committed also to full employment, at least on paper, but often this is important. So we have seen, ever since the global financial crisis in 2008, we have seen successive governments, beginning from Obama and Trump and Biden, all striving to ensure close to full employment. Real wages have undoubtedly suffered. Working conditions have also deteriorated. But there is that kind of commitment in the US, but exceptionally in the US. And this is, I think, very important to recognize, because there is a significant contradiction between the US and its NATO allies, which I think we must recognize when we do our analysis. It's also important, I think, for us to recognize that the policies introduced to deal with the global financial crisis and the following Great Recession included policies which actually facilitated a great deal of financialization, which I won't elaborate on right now. And what we have seen since then, but particularly in the last 2.5 years or so, has been the US raising interest rates in ways which are completely unnecessary. Many of us who studied economics in the 20th century, and we were exposed to people like Stanley Fischer, subsequently deputy managing director of the IMF, and also very importantly vice chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, and Rudiger Dornbusch. A lot of other people as well, who are really very, very mainstream economists, who are all talking about low double-digit inflation as being very, very acceptable, and more importantly, necessary for growth. We now have a situation where we have a fixation with a 2% limit on inflation targeting, which has no theoretical basis and no empirical basis either. Just allow me to remind you, because many of you may not realize it, that this 2% target came out of something which was coined by the New Zealand finance minister in 1989. To realize his own ambitions to become party leader, the New Zealand foreign minister at that time came up with the slogan of 2 by 92. In other words, 2% inflation by 1992, referring to 1992. And that was the origin of this 2% target. This target has got no other basis except an arbitrary decision by the New Zealand foreign minister, which subsequently has influenced everybody. I still remember, for example, I think Jan Kregel was there in the audience in 2010. There was a central bank, the Malaysian Central Bank had an anniversary meeting to which Joseph Stiglitz was invited to speak, and he made a critique of inflation targeting. And it was the South African Central Bank, Reserve Bank head, at that time, Tito Mboweni, subsequently became finance minister of South Africa, former member of the Communist Party of South Africa, who led the attack on this 2%, on Stiglitz's 2% criticism. In other words, we have, people loyally reciting this 2% target without having any theoretical reason. Even on the basis of neoclassical economics, there is no reasoning. Okay, it's completely arbitrary. And so basically what this has meant has been that you have a recessionary or contractionary reduction, influence on macroeconomic policy, so on the monetary front. Added to that, of course, you have the pressures for fiscal austerity, etc., which have basically augmented or rather complemented this pressure on the monetary side with fiscal policies as well. You have a lot of pressures in many countries, especially smaller developing countries, where you're told that fiscal policy is too important to be left to finance ministers, but rather you need fiscal boards to set what would be acceptable deficit levels and so on and so forth. So you have a very, very dangerous situation which has a basic tendency towards stagnation in the world. And this has important consequences, and as I said, the US is exceptional in this regard. And so incredibly, the rest of the West, I say the West deliberately because Japan does not subscribe to this kind of thinking, the rest of the West goes along with this thinking for no rhyme or reason. And this, I think, is very important, and it's very important to marshal the forces to challenge this kind of dogmatism which you find in passing off as economic thinking. Now, there are many other things which can be said, but basically, I think we all know that there have been tremendous capital outflows as a result of the raising of interest rates by the US Fed in the last 2.5 years. And this has basically meant a flight of capital, and the poorest countries have become the worst off. This has been shown by very mainstream commentators such as Martin Wolf, who has shown that basically whatever resources came into the low income countries have basically gone. Now, I think one has to recognize also that worsening this whole situation, this macroeconomic situation, has been the Cold War and the so-called new geopolitics. And this new geopolitics has basically also served to have a depressive effect. So you have the prioritization of geopolitical considerations at the expense of developmental and other considerations. So you have, for example, the restriction of investment flows, restriction of technology, sanctions being the weaponization of sanctions as a normal part of economic policy. It's not even considered something you need to go to the UN Security Council to get support for. So people report sanctions as if they are as if they're acceptable. Whereas under the UN Charter, it should be made clear that all these sanctions are illegal sanctions. They are illegal under international law. But have you heard anyone talking about taking the perpetrators of these sanctions to some kind of judicial treatment, whatever the process is? So the point I want to make, the last point I want to make in this connection, is that if you look at the sources of the recent increase in inflation, most of it has got to do with supply side disruptions. Okay, supply side disruptions for various reasons. Most recently, of course, we had the pandemic associated supply side disruptions. But then you also have those supply side disruptions associated with unilateral sanctions, which I described earlier. And of course, we have seen how all this has basically meant, for example, that internationally agreed climate targets have also been abandoned in the process. I've mentioned before that for example, the commitment to get rid of coal was abandoned within less than half a year, and so on and so forth. In other words, you have a complete sidelining of international law and no pretense of adhering to international law. So we are living in a situation of partial anarchy. I don't want to exaggerate it and say we are living in a situation of complete anarchy, but we're living in a situation of partial anarchy, where the unipolar moment, which came about after the end of the First Cold War, basically is seen as the legitimate basis for international hegemony. This, I think, is important because the Gramscian notion of hegemony is basically being violated by this direct affronts to international law and any claim to legitimacy. Oh, sorry. Sorry about this. Okay. So one slide seems to have disappeared. But that slide was basically an argument about how the global south in various different ways faces tremendous constraints. But it's also important for us to be sensitive to the diversity of the global south. So the problems faced by the poorest countries, for example, the low-income countries I referred to earlier, are quite different from the problems faced in East Asia, for example, where you do not have significant significant gap in the foreign exchange. Different again from many other situations which we have been discussing over the last 2 days. So let me then emphasize that we now have a situation where there are real that this Cold War which is being perpetrated right now has tremendous implications for all of us, which I don't have time to get to elaborate on, but I think are quite obvious in many ways to all of you. Now, I want to emphasize that we now have a curious situation where the first deputy managing director of the IMF, Gita Gopinath, has basically made the argument that developing countries should be non-aligned. I never expected the number 2 person in the IMF to actually make this argument, but she made this argument in an address to the International Economic Association, which some of you may have attended at the end of last year. But the point is a very important point, because you now have a situation where even within the halls of power, there is no legitimacy for the Cold War. And therefore, I think it's very important that we encourage people, mainstream people included, that not to take this Gita Gopinath's argument quite seriously and not to be aligned in this situation. Now we now have a clear transition to what we might call a second Cold War. But since I'm running out of time, let me skip the details of this. These are all probably familiar to many of you. And we also have a situation where we have essentially a new Cold War, which I won't get into right now. Now, where would Europe stand? And I don't want to reduce Europe into the High Commissioner for Europe, which is the second most important official for the European Commission. Okay, after Ursula von der Leyen, there is a man named Josep Borrell. Josep Borrell belongs to the Catalan Socialist Party. But look at what he has to say. The rest of the world is a jungle, and the jungle will invade the garden. In order to protect the garden, the gardeners have to go to the jungle. Otherwise, the rest of the world will invade us. This is the mentality of the second highest official, and I can assure you, Ursula von der Leyen is no better, if not worse. Okay, so we have a situation now where we cannot even count on Europe. This is liberal left Europe, yeah, We're not talking about the European right, okay? We're talking about liberal left Europe. This is the situation which we face. And that's why I want to make that there are many people who argue that non-alignment is irrelevant now, including the foreign minister of India. But this is a real problem. It's a real problem now that there is no recognition of the legitimacy and the need for a non-alignment, not a non-alignment of the old type from 1961, Belgrade, etc., but a new non-alignment, in a sense invoking Bandung and the spirit of non-alignment which was proposed in 1955. And this, I think, is extremely important. And so this new non-alignment, I would suggest to you, is something which would involve not only a commitment to non-alignment in the traditional sense, but I would suggest two other elements of this new non-alignment. One is a commitment to development. You can call it the SDGs or whatever you'd like to call it. That is very important. And secondly, and very, very importantly, a commitment to peace. When we think about the world as not one which is fundamentally antagonistic, when you rethink the world as one as potentially cooperative, then that forces us to rethink much of our economics and so on. So that, I would suggest to you, is the challenge which we face going forward in the world today. It has tremendous implications in many aspects of our life, but this is why I think it was very timely that this meeting, this conference, be held before the Brazilian engagement, and we have an opportunity, thanks to some of you who are here, to try to convey this, because whether you like it or not, the G20 is quite influential, and also very importantly, whether you like it or not, the BRICS are very influential. Okay, I'm not suggesting that the BRICS are truly representative of the global South, by no means, but nonetheless, one has to make the best of the means which are available to us if we are to mount a successful and effective resistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Jomo. With your permission, maybe I would like to eat into our next session by 15 minutes, so we can have, I'm sure we'll recover it during break. It means rushing you through your tea break, but probably a price worth paying to have a conversation. So the floor is open. Some brief remarks, don't carry on, so that a few more people might. Let's take about 4 at the moment, and then we have a response. Okay, starting from my nearest. Yeah, to go for it. So we'll go this way.
Thank you both for very insightful and very thought-provoking presentations. And when I was listening, actually to both of you, but you know, Walden, you're right. But there is this whole dilemma we all face, which is that there is a global situation in which we support certain actors, or we do not support certain other actors. But also we know that those actors internally are really dreadful. Okay, I mean, let's not, I mean, my own country is a classic example, but you mentioned Saudi Arabia and Qatar as, you know, playing a very influential role through their sovereign wealth funds. We know what those sovereign wealth funds are used for now. There's very little to make us expect that suddenly MBS is going to turn into a good guy, Mother Teresa type, you know? I mean, it's not going to, so how do we sort of resolve this contradiction between what we know from their internal political economy? Because, and this relates to what, you know, you were saying, Jomo, I do see your point, but you know, Bandung also consisted of a whole lot of countries who had a very different national progressive agenda. Here we have a whole bunch of countries where the leaders of these countries, I don't even know if they're pursuing interests in, you know, their own country's interests or their own people's interests. They're presenting the interests of their elites. and often in very desperate ways. I'm just wondering whether the non-alignment of a whole conglomeration of often very dubious governments would have the same kind of impact. I mean, I'm not disputing the reality of what it is. I'm just saying, when we hitch our wagons to somebody, are we, fully aware of what's inside those wagons?
Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations, situating the entire discussions we've been having in the context of the new Cold War, the changing geopolitical dynamics. I have a very specific question on the point made on non-alignment. You referred to our foreign minister saying no, non-alignment is irrelevant. We no longer, we don't send our prime minister to any of this, nothing to do with it. But they have justified it by saying it's not non-alignment, India is multi-aligned. So the way he distinguishes this from non-alignment is that in non-alignment, you don't align yourself with any of the big power blocks. In multi-alignment, you align yourself, then you become a part of every power block. So India is part of SEO, it's part of Quad, it's part of BRICS, it's part of whatever G, X, Y, Z. So how do you theorize, understand this distinction between non-alignment and multi-alignment? Is it really, is it a genuine distinction or is it wordplay? Just your thoughts. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, keep going. The next one. That would be the third one.
Thank you. I will talk in Spanish, just for word for translation. Muchísimas gracias por sus presentaciones, son muy interesantes sobre.
Very interesting. My name is Mariana Parizo from UNAM in Mexico, and I have a few questions. You talked about the geopolitical interests of non-alignment in the Global South. And I agree that there are a lot of different Global Souths at stake in terms of different interests. What each country is searching for at an international level. I believe that the difference between the first Cold War and this Cold War is that this one has different powers with different national interests. And in the discussion of the 1990s about the possible multilateralism and the advance of regionalism, how we can close the gap between the interests of the Western world and the non-Western world, because it's difficult that these two sides understand each other.
Okay, thank you so much for the very powerful speeches. And so I have two questions, I think, each for the two speakers. For Walden, so we know, what NATO has been doing and trying to, really expand in Asia, right? Which really, I think, compromise all these regional security and peace and this collective goal of sustainable development and build regional supply chain, etc. And Philippines President Marco Jr., of course, is opening welcoming arms to this. So I'm just wondering, what is the end game of the Philippines? And are there any oppositions within their domestic politics would play a countervailing role? And then I think I would also ask a similar question with the non-alignment, just like Professor Ghosh, but I'm from the other angle, which is, do you think that the countries are able to really maintain that non-alignment stance without the US pushing them to certain corners? I mean, I want to take the example of Vietnam. I mean, the bamboo diplomacy, right? It's a clear non-alignment stance, but the United States just 7 days ago declared that Vietnam as a non-market economy. So, these countries really, do they really have a choice to play the kind of non-alignment countries and play as sort of the connector, as Go in Touch would hope they play, right, in this global trade and investment as a connector to, these two oppositional blocks. But again, I am just very doubtful that these countries actually have a choice to remain that sort of non-alignment stance. Thank you so much.
Okay, let's take some responses, and then we have time to do another round. You go first.
Thank you. Allow me to. I mean, the basic issue raised by Jyoti Ghosh is, you have all these people you have to work with, where you have to, close your nose and get on with it. I mean, we do that all the time in our lives. We have been living in minority situations where we work in constrained circumstances. We try to build alliances to cope with our situations. Most people do not have very so-called democratic freedoms to be able to. So I mean, if you look at the spat right now over Boric and Maduro, okay, you can spend a lot of time debating about it, but right now I think the question is, we have to make a decision as to what is important, and as far as we are concerned, uniting the many to defeat the few is the priority. And that, I would say, basically means that you have alliances which are very, very specific around certain issues, not pretending that they are anything more than that. Otherwise, we will be very, very isolated, and we will not be able to. So we cannot expect alliances around everything, which only alliances on everything on our terms. And this, I think, is the challenge which we face. There are certain alliances which we may choose not to participate in. But I think, for example, you will find on many issues, you will find some strange bedfellows. So that, I mean, I'm used to working in a very, very minority situation, okay, where I don't even have a movement I can fall back on or refer to and so on. So, I'm not trying to impose my own circumstances on everybody else, but I think some difficult choices have to be made to recognize that there are certain things where you begin to work with people you would not normally work with. Now, the question on Indian non-alignment is very specifically Indian. I won't get into that right now. And the Latin American question, I couldn't get the thrust. If somebody could please summarize the question on Latin America, otherwise we'll move on. Then the U.S. constraints on non-alignment. Let's face it, yeah. A lot of the people who are, for example, in the BRICS are not exactly my best friends. Okay, I'm not terribly keen, especially on the expanded BRICS. But even the old BRICS, Bolsonaro was certainly not my best friend. Okay, neither is Modi. But insofar as they take a position independent of the major powers, I'm prepared to work with them, and that's basically what I guess. In many ways, the questions have all come down to this basic issue of who you work with and so on. On domestic issues, we are probably on very, very different. We take very, very different positions. Let me stop here because I think Walden has more to contribute.
Thank you. On the same question that Jayati raised and Jomo has addressed, I do think that yes, we have a diversity of actors. Some of them, clearly on our side, some not so, some having real interests when it comes to their politics and their economics. But I would just like to say that one of the things that has really impressed me is the way, that so many countries and governments have united in support of the Palestinian people's struggle. And a number of different actors might do this out of principle, and others because they are pressured. So it does, I think we do need to take it, as Jomo said, from issue to issue. And in many cases, there is going to be a legitimacy question involved. People or governments, even the most unsavory ones, like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to gain global legitimacy might in fact be constrained, to take certain positions and to use their funds in certain ways. So, the need for legitimacy as global actors is very important as a pressure point for many of these governments. Secondly, I think on just the question of the BRICS, my sense is, yes, this formation has a long way to go. Now that it's expanding, it's becoming more diverse, I think that there will be the necessity of really giving it much more structure in terms of decision-making. And if it has more structure, then I think the uses of funds like, that contributed by Saudi Arabia, China, Qatar, and others, there could be a much more neutral mechanism or bureaucratic mechanism that uses them, that will act in order to be able to allocate these funds much more for the needs of developing countries, especially the poorest countries. So I would think that that structure, as we saw yesterday, is still coming into being, but it's very important if we're going to have those resources, in fact, allocated in a very good way for that structure to speed up at this point in time, especially since the membership is increasing at a very fast rate. With respect to the question of bridging the gap between the West and the rest, I think that is much more difficult at this point than, say, about 10 years ago. I think we now have a situation whereby really the global elites in the West have become much more defensive of their interests. Now, whether they belong to the far right or they belong to the more Cold War coalition, there is this very strong sense of defensiveness against the demands of the South. So I think within the current global structures, it's becoming more and more difficult to be able to bridge that gap. And I would imagine some of you would know this better. Even in the United Nations, this is not a very easy task at this point in time. With respect to non-alignment, with the Philippines, I think this was raised. Yes, the Philippines has embraced the United States totally at this point in time. I mean, to be honest about it, our defense and foreign policy has almost been completely outsourced to Washington. Blackmail diplomacy is at work because the president, with whom I served in Congress, incidentally, has a very faint notion of what is national interest. He has a very strong sense of what is his family's interest. And that family has $5 to $10 billion dollars in assets spread out throughout the West, mainly. And they know what happens. They saw how the oligarchs of Putin, were sanctioned and their assets were seized or frozen. And that's what the Marcoses really are afraid of at this point. So we have a situation that is not very good. There are those of us who are pushing to, in fact, have a situation more like the Vietnamese, which is to have a really independent foreign policy from both China and from the United States. But that's sort of the very difficult situation to maintain at this point, because the Cold War has now affected the dynastic situation, whereby the Duterte family, which former president, has sided with China, and the Marcos family is now practically dependent on the United States. So there is now, the Cold War has built itself into the dynastic warfare in the Philippines, and those of us who have been pushing for an independent foreign policy like the Vietnamese are not making good inroads recently. So I would just like to leave it there for the time being.
I fear that we have run out of time, sadly. So my apologies to those on the left. It is always like this. It is always like this. All right. So final hand of applause for the two speakers. Thank you very much.